Okay, just wanted to do a couple of quick things in Starlink to kind of overview some of the big issues here. Um, Number one, uh, satellite internet's been around for a long time, but previous versions of satellite internet had had satellites running very high, geostationary satellites, and you only need a few to cover the Earth, and they'd have this big cone, right, that would come down and cover the Earth. They were relatively slow and they had a lot high latency. So, but with the advantage of these things was though that you could have a few of them, right, that would stay in the same position relative to the Earth, and as the Earth spun, it would stay with you. But it took a long time for data to get from the ground to the satellite and back down again. That's called latency. Now, latency is important only for certain types of applications. If you are streaming a movie like Netflix, it is counterintuitive, but latency is not a problem when you're streaming a movie. Why is that? Well, latency is one of these things where imagine a phone call that you've had in the past. Have you ever had a phone call where you're talking to someone and it seems to take an extra second for when you say it for it to get to the person, and then sometimes they end up talking over over your response because, and then when they talk to you the same thing happens. It takes like a second for you to get, so this in the dead air you start talking and you don't realize they're responding. This is because of latency, and very often it's because of satellites. What would happen is you would start talking, your voice would bounce up off of the satellite and then come down. In that meantime, there was a problem. So in synchronous applications like a phone conversation or a Zoom call, that delay is a problem. However, there are other applications where synchronicity is not as important as, say, flow. So if you had a movie, yeah, it may take an extra second for that movie to get started, right? But once it gets started, it goes up over the satellite and comes down, but the flow just continues to flow. So the latency does not become a problem. So it's only certain types of applications. Certainly email, latency, not a problem, right? Tweets, not a problem, right? So there's things like that latency is not a problem. But if you had a video chat or you had a voice call, latency becomes a problem. So that's why this whole big thing about Starlink being low latency. They're not way up here in the sky. They're flying very close to the Earth, and they're going quickly over the horizon. So it's not just one. You need a network of these devices. And there are thousands and thousands of these devices that are circling the Earth. So that's one of the big issues. So, and if we take a look at the amount of satellites that are out there, right? Active satellites since 1957, it just skyrockets, right, in 2020. Now, this becomes a problem in a few ways. One, for astronomers, right? So astronomers are getting light noise off of these satellites. So the satellite is flying overhead, and the light is reflecting off the satellites back down to the Earth. Why is that a problem? Well, have you ever been out in the wilderness at night, far away from a town, and you look up at the sky and there's tons and tons of stars? Yet when you come into a town, not that far away, where you've got street lights and businesses, right? You've got all this local light. That sort of prevents you from seeing out into the sky, so you don't see these stars. The stars didn't go away. You're just being blocked by light reflection. Well, because these satellites are reflecting light from sources in the sky, like maybe coming around the Earth and reflecting off the satellite and coming down, or reflecting off of other celestial objects and coming down, it's less easy for us to see out past them. So astronomers are having a problem with these out there. Second big issue is space junk, right? Now, I won't play these videos. I'll leave these videos for you to kind of look at on your own. But imagine that we've got all these satellites which have gone up since 1957. Some of them active, some of them not. Also, in addition to those satellites, there's a bunch of other, pieces of rockets or space junk that have been sort of launched up into space that are no longer active and working, and they're sort of circling the Earth. Now these things are moving at thousands of miles an hour, and If you have two of them sort of collide, then all of a sudden, boom, they explode. And you have all this shrapnel. Now, each one of those little pieces now is flying at 17,000 miles an hour. So they can hit things. And now suddenly we start having this domino effect of all these different satellites exploding. And now we just got a belt of junk around the Earth, and the orbit is unusable. That's not a crazy idea. This is called the Kepler effect. And we've seen things like just a single fleck of paint almost took out the International Space Station. It cracked a window. And if that window had cracked and opened up, it would have lost pressurization. It would have been a big deal. And if it was something slightly larger, it could have maybe even destroyed the Space Center. So the idea that we've got all these things floating out there is a problem. And if they begin to sort of explode and we start having the Kepler effect, that's even a bigger problem. How do we solve that? How do we clean that up? Well, to sort of put some scope on this, I've sort of pulled up this image, the Great Garbage Patch, right? In the Pacific, due to currents, we've got these huge belts of garbage, mostly plastic, that is floating on the surface, and we can't clean it up. I mean, we're talking about things the size of a state, these garbage patches. So this is on Earth. This is at a smaller scale. We could send a boat out in theory to start cleaning this up, yet we seem to be incapable of doing that. How are we going to handle this if this begins to happen in space? This is a big, big issue. All right. If we take a look at some of the competitive environments, right? Who would use Starlink? Well, a lot of people will just use traditional internet, right? They'll have a cable coming to their house, or they'll have a cellular connection. Those are all perfectly fine. In fact, it would be unlikely that you would replace a good cable or cellular connection if you had a strong one with Starlink. Because if you had 5G, 5G is going to be competitive at Starlink, but for a lot less money and with a lot less maintenance costs for the organization. Where would you terrestrially use Starlink? Okay, so maybe you've got a cabin off the grid in the mountains someplace, way back in the woods. Great. There's absolutely no cable service there, and there's no cell service because you're too far away from a tower. Remember, with a cellular tower, you have to be in so many miles of the tower for a 4G signal. I believe it's like within 10 or 15 miles of a tower that you've got to be to get the cellular signal. Certainly can't go to more than 30 miles because at 30 miles the curvature of the Earth begins to become a problem. So let's say 10 or 15 miles for 4G. Well, for 5G, they measure it in feet. You've got to be like 1,500 feet from a tower. So it's not even miles, it's feet. So, and to pay for that tower, you have to have lots of people using the tower. Otherwise, you're not capitalizing the cost of the tower. So cellular service is not going to be good for remote people. You'll also have these situations where people do have cellular, do have cable, but they're still sort of remote. An example, I have a brother who has a vacation home on Block Island. And he loves to go up there, but he gets terrible internet service because they've got to have an undersea cable go from the island back to the mainland in Rhode Island. And the entire island shares this one cable, and it's not quite big enough, right? So, but to replace the cable is ridiculously expensive, so you suffer. So he's thinking about putting in Starlink because he'll get faster, more reliable internet than what he's getting right now. So again, not typical. Traditional satellites, fine. Those are the geostationary ones. But there are certain applications, like if my brother had a geostationary satellite, he does a lot of Zoom calls from his beach house. Is that going to work well? Probably not over a geostationary satellite because of the latency. But you have all these other companies like Telesat and OneWeb and Hughes and Viasat, and they're all trying to get into this business of sort of this mesh satellite. The biggest player, of course, being the Kuiper project from Amazon, who's already started launching. And Kuiper's trying to do the exact same thing that you've got going on at SpaceX. And they've got the funding, and they've also got their own rockets. They've got the Blue Origin rockets that Jeff Bezos also owns. So some of these other competitors don't have their own rockets. And if you follow the news recently, you'll see that many of the SpaceX's competitors like United that are trying to that have rockets that launch satellites into space are now trying to rework their rockets so there's no available space. So many of their competitors are actually going to SpaceX to launch their satellites, which is an interesting phenomenon. Okay, we've got regulatory issues. Who gets to decide how many satellites you can put up? Well, the U.S., if you're launching from the U.S., the U.S. Space Administration does decide how many satellites go up. However, what if Russia decides to put satellites up? What if China decides to put satellites up? Who gets to decide who gets what area of space, right? Because those satellites that we've got being launched from the U.S. by SpaceX do circle the Earth. Should South Africa have a say? Should Uruguay have a say? Should the Solomon Islands have a say in what satellite goes where? Right? I mean, they're all residents of the Earth, right? They're all citizens of the Earth. So why shouldn't they have a say about something that affects the entire Earth? So this is going to become a real problem, kind of going forward. In fact, in the Ukraine has been using satellites from SpaceX to sort of communicate on the internet during the war, and the Russians have threatened to shoot down SpaceX satellites or Starlink satellites because they consider them to be infrastructure for the enemy. So, kind of a problem. One video I will play briefly is the tragedies of the commons. Well, maybe I won't play this. I'll just kind of talk through this. This is a video. This is a TEDx video here. I'd encourage you to view this. The tragedy of the commons is something that goes back over 100 years. It was a pamphlet that was written to sort of describe how if you have a sort of town commons, right? These big fields that are owned by a town, and usually in the center of town, right? And historically, through when America was an agrarian society, you could bring your sheep to the commons and your cattle to the commons, and they could graze on the commons, and that's fine, right? That's great. It's like a public good. But what happens if one person brings a whole bunch of cattle or a whole bunch of sheep to graze on the commons? Well, they may eat up all of the available grass, and could actually destroy the common resource that's good for everyone. Now, if we extend this idea, you could be talking about, unintended consequences of your actions, or even intended consequences, right? So, if you have fish in a pond and everyone's limited to one fish so that the pond could repopulate, but you start sneaking a second fish or a third fish, well, maybe what you're doing is actually destroying the ability of that resource to repopulate itself. So that not only hurts you, but it hurts everyone else. What if you've got sort of these other negative externalities, like you start producing cheap electricity through coal, and that starts polluting the air, and that air blows downstream from the people who are getting the benefit of the cheap electricity. So this simple concept of the tragedy of the commons, of that there's an incentive to actually cheat on your limit so that you get some extra personal benefit, is not it's an important aspect of this discussion, because who gets to capitalize space? Is it the U.S.? Is it SpaceX? And what happens if they overuse this asset? And who's then affected by this? So this is a whole comment here. Is there a first mover advantage? In this, if you get there first, do you have an advantage? In this case, there may be, especially if you can maintain the location of those satellites, because once the satellite's in place, no one else can put something in that exact same orbit, right? So there's going to be an effect here. So SpaceX has got to rush to get real estate in space before the Kuiper project comes and tries to get the same space, or OneWeb, or Telesat, or Hughes, or the Canadians, or the Chinese, or the Europeans, right? And work from home does have an effect on this, because people will start trying to maybe work in more remote places and start buying into this. We won't, getting into the market, the idea of it's going to grow. I think part of this is trying to forecast the available demand, and you start looking at, who has awareness, who has interest, who's making the decision to buy, and and do they actually do the action? Where are these people located? So you want people who are remote around the world. And as we look at the globe, remember this can be a global phenomenon. You could start talking about where this sits. We could also start talking about pricing here. Now, how do you price this? Um, you know, let's think about, like, say, pricing for drug companies. Pricing for pharmaceuticals in the U.S. is higher than that same pharmaceutical in Canada. Pricing, or in Europe, it's higher than it would be in Central Africa or in say India. Why? Well, because the drug companies are trying to capitalize their expenses from these first world countries, and yes, they'll sell to these other countries at a lower price because they see them as just additional revenue, right? The Canadian government sets the price of all pharmaceuticals in Canada. Why would a drug company like Pfizer sell a drug they're selling in the U.S. for $1,000 for only $200 in Canada? Why? Because Canada's a small market, and this is just extra revenue, and they're not going to sell it any other way than to sell it at the price that the government sets, right? So when we begin to take a look at pricing, it's going to be different in different locations around the world based upon that location's ability to support that price. You may look to make your money on the first world, like the US and Europe, and you may say any additional revenue that's coming from a third world country is just gravy, right? Second, when you start pricing this, you might price this based upon not the cost, but the value. So, for example, if I'm currently paying $200 a month for a geostationary satellite with a high latency, would I spend $200 a month to get a low latency, higher speed connection with more reliability from SpaceX? And the answer is yes. So they're pricing themselves based upon what people are currently spending for this service. Getting crappy service, would they spend the same or even slightly more to get SpaceX? And the answer is usually yes. So it's not based upon their cost, it's based upon the value they perceive that the customers are getting from them. Okay. Let me see some of these other satellites are growing very quickly. Not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but we could take a look at the Kuiper project. You could take a look at the fact that there's been some recent problems with Starship. Starship is their next big project, which is going to build a much heavier lift rocket, and that has recently had some issues of blowing up during trials. So good thing in some ways because they're learning, but obviously that's a challenge that it hasn't quite worked yet. And eventually they're looking to do further stuff out. Also, by the way, side note, they're also NASA's only source now to get stuff up to the International Space Station, because earlier what I mentioned about their competitors not being around. So this is a very interesting company to sort of look at and to sort of kind of figure out where their goal forward is. They have not had, if you take a look at the more recent data, they have not had the sales they hope to have had, but they're actually at this point looking at being profitable, if not now, very soon. So, and this is a much longer term play. So it's a interesting idea. I hope this was a valuable case. All right, see you in the next video.